Long before it was an Xbox One exclusive title before eventually hitting PCs and thus making it not exclusive to Xbox One, Killer Instinct was a fighting game of the 1990s that aimed to be different from the other fighting games of the time by making combos, where you chain together a series of attacks that usually yield devastating results, a focal point of the gameplay. It was a killer hit, no pun intended, that eventually made its way over to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and even the Game Boy, the latter of which is today's subject matter. And considering there were some concessions that needed to be made in order to fit the game onto an SNES game pack, while at the same time making it somewhat playable or even good, one would assume this Game Boy conversion of Killer Instinct would be the drizzling shits due to the drastic difference in hardware specs. Well, one would be wrong in making that assumption, but that's jumping ahead. Killer Instinct on Game Boy gives you 8 of the 10 killer combatants of the arcade game, with Cinder and Riptor being the only holdouts for this outing. Anyway, the game is pretty much the same as it always was, a one-on-one fighting game where you drain your opponent of health using a string of moves to produce damaging combos. The longer the combo, the better, but be careful, combos can be broken with a well-timed combo breaker. Once your opponent is in the danger zone, you have a chance to either perform a danger or finishing move, an ultra combo, a humiliation move where your opponent does a little dance, or absolutely nothing at all. Naturally, concessions were made to make Killer Instinct possible on the Game Boy: 2 less fighters, 4 less buttons, no knockoffs or ultimate combo finishes, a lot less hardware, and I'd imagine some of the combos you could pull off in the arcade version may have been lost in translation, and one would be forgiven for expecting this port to turn out badly on the Game Boy, especially given other fighting game hits on the platform that turned out to be less than stellar outings. But Rare actually managed to pull off a very competent version of Killer Instinct on the Game Boy. Hell, I'd probably take it a step further and call it one of the best fighting games on Game Boy, which is a rather pleasant surprise. The 6-button setup of the arcade original has been reduced to 2 buttons, thus making the moveset very simplified. To the best of my knowledge, everyone seems to have all their usual moves barring some missing combos and finishes. Some moves might even have different inputs compared to the bigger brothers, and yet somehow it just works exceptionally well, with control being extremely top-notch in this regard. Pulling off moves and combos is almost effortless if you know how to pull them off, the response time is pretty good, and while the simplistic button setup means gameplay basically breaks down to button mashing and hoping you luck out on a good combo, there is still a bit of skill involved in trying to execute some particularly devastating chains, the difficulty of which there are 5 settings is varied enough that you could go for a really easy time, stick with the default yet firm normal difficulty, or step it up a notch or 2 for a real ass-kicking session. There's not much in terms of game modes. You have the traditional arcade mode as well as a practice mode to practice your moves and combos, and that's about it really. You could also play 2-player battles via Game Link, but this is one of the few games compatible with the Super Game Boy accessory that not only offers the usual enhancements such as its own border, color palettes, and slightly more colorful intermission screens, but you could also do 2-player battles if you have a second controller on hand, which is a somewhat rare feature with these Super Game Boy enhanced game packs. Rare managed a miracle in replicating the CG rendered visuals of the arcade game over to this Game Boy format and did a pretty good job of it, I think. The backgrounds look alright with some missing details, but nothing too drastic, and there's even a bit of parallax scrolling tossed in for good measure. The fighters themselves, while a bit on the small side, look good enough to the point where you can recognize who's who, more or less, and on top of that, the animation is silky smooth by Game Boy standards. There is a concern where the detail is such that it makes it difficult to make out what's going on due to everything potentially blending in together, especially on older Game Boy units. But Rare actually had a bit of foresight here, implementing an option of setting the graphics to dark, a default setting on the Super Game Boy, or you could set it to a lighter setting where you could follow the action much more easily, which is helpful on the portable front. And then you got some killer cuts recreated into 8-bit Game Boy mono, and the tunes sound pretty accurate to the arcade tracks, at least in terms of the compositions, not so much the quality since there's an obvious wide gap in hardware difference. You also get some classic 8-bit sound effects that's distinct to Rare developed 8-bit titles, which is something, I guess. Naturally, there are no voiceovers to be found here, no crazy announcer announcing what combo you just did, which shouldn't be much of a surprise considering it's Game Boy and, well, yeah. Overall, Killer Instinct is a fine fighter on the Game Boy and could very well lay claim to being one of the system's best fighters. Even when stripped to its basic components, you've got a faithful little adaptation that makes the most of its hardware limitations and comes out with a pretty smooth and enjoyable little fighter in the process. Even years later, this version holds its own rather well, and if nothing else, its simplified format could serve as an introduction to the series for novice players before they move on to the more complete versions found elsewhere. All in all, Killer Instinct for Game Boy gets the job done just fine.